Welcome to the Creation Matters podcast, where we use science to share the reliability and truth of God's Word. I am your host, Preston Knapp, and joining me in studio today is Curtis Baker. He is the co-founder and president of Creation Ministries of the Ozarks and of the Creation Experience Museum. Curtis is certified in conservation and environmental sciences. He's also certified as a master naturalist with the Missouri Department of Conservation and is a graduate of Answers in Genesis Creation College. So, Curtis, welcome back to the broadcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you having me on today.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. So today we are going to be talking about why we are finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones. You know, it's not something that a lot of people would necessarily expect when we're looking at fossils to find soft tissue inside of them. So it's a very needful topic to look at today in terms of science.
No pun intended, but I think that's something we need to dig into.
I would agree. So when fossils come out of the ground, is it kind of standard procedure to test what's inside of them, or what's normally done with fossils?
Absolutely not, Preston. Most of the time when they were pulling them out of the ground, they assumed, because of their assumed ages of these bones being multiple millions of years old, that there's no need to test for these biomaterials, these soft tissues and other items, because according to secular science's best research, that material cannot and would not last millions of years. Therefore, why waste the time, money, and energy to search for something that we know for sure would not be there? So whenever this stuff started first surfacing and began showing up in peer-review articles, it did catch the attention of some people like ourselves and other ministries who said, wait a minute, I didn't think this was supposed to be there. So that is why a lot of the research had not been done, but now it's being done on a more grander scale.
I see. So when we talk about soft tissues or original biomolecules or biomaterial and things like that, what exactly are we talking about?
Most of the time what they're referring to is the things they'll find like collagen, which is a form of the soft tissues. You're going to find blood cells. You're going to find blood clots. These kind of things that we would think of, oh, okay, this is something organic inside the body that should have been dissipated by now. It should not be in there.
Right, because with fossilization, all the original biomaterial is supposed to be replaced by rock, right?
Correct. It's all supposed to be mineralized by now, have that mineral transfer going on. Nothing should be there, according to their data.
So when we do find fossils with the soft tissue in it, can soft tissue last for millions of years, or what's kind of the expiration date on that?
Well, that's a good question. That depends on who you ask. If you ask secular scientists right off the bat, is this expected to last 65 million years plus? Because some of the dinosaur bones, they say, date even older than that. Their first answer is absolutely not. Then you say, well, how far back have you found this? And even using their dating methods, they're only talking like 1 million, not even 2 million years old, according to their dating methods. They say there's not enough material left beyond that to actually examine. Well, now we're running out of material in 1 or 2 million years, according to them. So again, how old are the dinosaurs? They say 65 million years at least. They could be older. But wait a minute, we're finding these soft tissues, we're finding the blood cells, the blood vessels in there. So that automatically tells us their dating methods are wrong. So what they're doing now is they're trying to find a way to justify this material to be preserved 65 million years and beyond, rather than say we were wrong. Now, again, when they even start talking about this lasting 1 million years or 200,000 years, those are guesses. Those are assumptions. Those are based off things they think they know. A lot of times they're using the age of the rock that they found the fossil in as the starting spot. Well, this rock is this old. Therefore, anything in that rock has to be at least this old. They're using a false dating methods on the rocks, and which leads them to a false dating method of the fossils.
I think a common assumption that a lot of people have when we're talking about dinosaur fossils especially, but really any kind of fossil, is that the age of that fossil is established. And, that's just something that is a given.
Yeah.
And that almost like they come up with name tags.
Yeah.
But you've, of course, been involved in many fossil digs and stuff. And it's interesting that you mentioned it's the age of the rock that they go off of. So is that, what are they using to test the rock? Because a lot of these rocks are sedimentary, and it's my understanding you really can't test sedimentary rock for age, but maybe I'm wrong on that.
Well, a lot of times what they're looking for is they're looking for radioisotopes. And even in sedimentary rock, they're going to say, well, we can date the volcanic ash that's in there.
I see.
Do we find iridium? Do we find these kind of things? What do we find in those rock layers that can give us some kind of long ages? They're always looking for that next thing. Again, it's all based off the assumption they know the age of the rock. They don't know the age of the rock because they were not there when the rock was put down or the soft sediments were put down. And you have to remember, they cannot date anything that is liquid or soft or still in the process of turning into solid. So if it's mud, they're not going to try to do radioisotope dating. If it's molten lava, they're not going to attempt it because it's impossible because you still have the exchange, you have the escape of the radioisotopes. When it hardens in the rock, they assume it is sealed off, and any of the material left in there, the radioisotopes, they can measure the amount that remains, and through deduction, safely assume that we know how much it started with, and we do A minus B equals C. That's how old it is. But again, they don't know how much the material was to begin with. So that in itself, you cannot really accurately date rock layers. Now, if you can't accurately date that, so how can you trust it whenever you're saying, well, if we can't trust how old the rocks are, how do we know how old the bones are? And that's one of the problems with these dating methods that they run into.
I think that is significant that it's the rocks they use to date the fossils. They aren't testing the fossils themselves for a date per se. It's the rocks.
Yeah, because if you test the fossils themselves, you're going to find material in there that tells you the bones are not as old as some scientists assumed.
And that's what we've been finding with the soft tissue.
Yes.
So how long have these discoveries with soft tissue been taking place? Dr. Mary Schweitzer's discovery in 2005 was the first one I heard of, but has it been going on longer than that?
Yes, they actually have some research papers. Dr. Brian Thomas at the Institute for Creation Research in Dallas, Texas, went back and started looking. He ran into 40 peer-reviewed articles or papers that had been submitted in publications since the 70s.
Wow.
Yeah, every decade, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. Mary Schweitzer's finding was big news because she really wanted to publicize it and wanted to put it out there for examination, which is actually good science. I applaud her for saying, hey, we have this. Let's look at it. Let's come up with an explanation because it's not making sense. While the other articles that were written were saying, we found it, and that would be about it. So the question is, if it has been around, been discovered for decades, why isn't more people talking about it? Because it does not match what they assumed they would or would not find to begin with. So yeah, hers is the most famous one, but it is not the original one. I think Dr. Brian Thomas actually, I have him on a quote where he said, I found 40 and I got tired of looking. There's probably more out there. Yeah.
All right. So for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with exactly that or for exactly what Mary Schweitzer found, could you kind of describe that discovery? Yeah,
she had a T-Rex bone, and she was in the lab where they take the thin little slice of the bone, and they look at it underneath very powerful microscopes. Sometimes it's electron microscopes, but usually it's 500 magnification or up. And they'll look at it underneath there, and what she was seeing was the same thing you would find in a modern, say, farm animal, a bone of a farm animal that passed away in the field, a horse or a cow or something. She was finding soft collagen tissues, still elastic and still stretching. She actually went on 60 Minutes, the news channel, and demonstrated live how you can stretch this material before a worldwide audience. She also found red blood cells inside there, hemoglobin.
Wow. And this was at the University of Montana, where she was an undergraduate?
She was working at the Museum of the Rockies there with Dr. Jack Horner, And she also was working at the Montana State University. The lab there was ran by Dr. Jack Horner. He was the lab director whenever she made the discovery. And she did not let him know right away. It took her some time, if I understand right, maybe a year or two before she revealed it to him. Well, I'm not exactly sure why she held on to the information, but when she shared it with a fellow colleague privately, that colleague said, "You have to tell him." So there was even some hesitation on her part. Just so you know, she has repeated this test on the soft tissues and the red blood cells multiple times under the same conditions, and she's getting the same results. Nobody, including myself, questions her work or her work ethic because she actually keeps doing the same test, getting the same results, which is good science.
Yeah, she's actually doing her job as a scientist to perform repeated experimentation, the same type of experimentation, and observing for the same kind of result. That's something that all good scientists should do. Is we should always be questioning our work, looking at it, not just doing one experiment and running with it. You should always just repeated test, repeated observation to make sure it's always the same. So yeah, we definitely commend her for doing a good work that sadly many of her colleagues don't do.
Exactly.
And that is very disappointing.
Yeah, and upon publishing the papers and stuff, she was taking a risk because naturally she's going to be criticized by her colleagues. At the same time, they're kind of afraid that the creationists, as ourselves, are going to get a hold of it and run with it and say, "See, that's proof of the young Earth creation model and this, that." Well, even if we did, we couldn't do it unless we had something to say, we think we could be right. If we were 100% wrong on it, it wouldn't take them very long to discredit us.
Right.
Yet, they're trying to keep it out of our hands so we don't make it public as much as they are.
So what would be some examples of the type of soft tissue that we've been finding in fossils?
One of the examples is Dr. Mark Arney's just done a lot of research with his Dinosaur Soft Tissue Institute. You can find more information about that at dsti.org, where him and his team take their big, powerful microscopes. They go in and they're finding nerves. They're finding the red blood cells, the blood clots, along with the collagen and these soft, stretchy tissues. We're finding all of that inside the same specimen, whether it's a triceratop horn or other items. It's not random, spotty. They're finding it very consistent throughout multiple samples of dinosaur fossils.
And I know one of the objections from, or maybe objections isn't the right word, maybe one of the suggestions put forth by some scientists is that, well, what they're really finding is just, biofilm from bacteria. Speak to that. Is there a way to tell the difference between the two?
Yeah, there is. That is a fallback position of theirs is, it's biofilm. Leftover biofilm could be growing from bacteria that was on the bone and it left behind this film that you can then stretch. The work that Dr. Mary Schweitzer has done, it by itself eliminates the possibility that this was biofilm. Her work is so extensive. But then you have other organizations that are coming along, they're like, no, this isn't biofilm. That is something they're throwing out as a plausible reason for being there, as a way to say, well, you question us, here's why. It's biofilm left over from bacteria. But then you look into that and you're like, wait a minute, this isn't biofilm material. It's not present here. So saying it's biofilm is one thing. Proving it's biofilm is something totally different. And they've yet to prove this biofilm.
Interesting. So what has been the reaction from the scientific community at large to these discoveries?
At first it was, oh, no, it shouldn't be there. We're not going to talk about it until we can explain it. Then it was, well, it's there, and we have some ideas we think could explain it. So they had this paradigm shift from it shouldn't be there, no reason to look for it, to it's there, let's not talk about it, to, well, we're going to talk about it, but now let's find some mechanisms that could possibly preserve it for 65 million years plus, to now they're at this spot where they're like, oh, it's not a big deal if you find it. It doesn't really change anything. So they've done this paradigm shift. They're now admitting it's there in mass, but they don't think it's a big deal because sooner or later, according to them, they are going to find a definite reason for it to be there in a dinosaur bone that they believe is 65 million years old that goes against what we would call the laws of science and preservation.
Is it very scientific to say that, well, someday we'll come to a explanation of why this should be here, but in the meantime, we're still going to cling to our assumed age of these fossils? Is that really good science?
It is not. You're holding on to data that you don't have. You're holding on to data that came out of basically thin air, came out from an idea. Somebody wrote it on a paper. That's what they use for their starting point. A wrong starting point will always, 100% of the time, lead you to the wrong conclusion. And that's where they're at. And they're just going to say, well, we have to be right. We need to be right. Therefore, anything that we find that doesn't match what we think is right, we'll just hold on to it till we get a good explanation. Because trust us, someday we're going to find it. What would be wrong with saying, whoops, we were wrong on this? Dinosaurs are not as old as we once thought. They're much younger. What would be the big deal? That's good science. Mm-hmm. If I found a rock outside and I thought the rock was 100 million years old, did some testing on it, I said, well, actually, this rock was probably just a few thousand years old. What would be wrong with that? Would it really change anything in the world? Would anybody get upset? Would people's lives be affected? No. It would just change the data in the science books, so you would think. So the question is then, why are they so dogmatic with millions of years? Why do they hold on to it first and foremost, even when the evidence contradicts it?
It seems like they must have a pretty good reason why they wouldn't want to accept this. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming it's because it's of their worldview. And since evolution really is a religion, mm-hmm. and it's a religion to replace God, naturalism is kind of the same idea. Let's make nature the governing force of the universe instead of a personal God mm-hmm. being the governing force of a universe, as to why they would reject that. What would you say?
I'd say you've hit the nail right on the head. Nature is their God. They worship the nature, and the Scripture speaks to that. It talks about those people who worship the creation rather than the Creator. This is nothing new in religion or worldviews. It has been around for millennia. That is what the modern-day evolutionary movement is. It is a religion that follows humanism and follows naturalism and says nature is our God. If they see genetic engineering, they say, okay, nature is the genetic engineer. Because obvious logic and reason comes into play. If you see genetic engineering, there has to be an engineer. Mm-hmm. If you see beauty and art, there has to be an artist. If you see design, there has to be a designer. They attribute all those attributes to something they call nature, Mother Nature, or things like that. That is their God. So, like you said, Preston, they are a religious group of people. They have a God that they worship, and they never waver from, and they cling to it tighter than anything. Their faith leads them down that road. It is a blind faith tied to an assumed God that they can't see, they can't touch, they can't produce. Sounds a lot like Christianity. Yet they say, oh, we're scientists. I don't believe in religion. I follow the science. Come on. If you're worshiping the creation, you are a religious person.
Yeah, they claim to be neutral. We as creationists will admit our biased.
Yes.
I'll do that quite often on tour. I'll tell people, yeah, I'm a Bible-believing Christian, but here's why.
Yeah.
We assume, and the scientific community, I think, likes the assumption that, oh, well, we're the neutral ones. But can science truly ever be neutral?
It can be just as neutral as your local newscast. When you hear a political view on the news, and if I ask 1,000 people, name me a neutral political newscast, nobody could. They're going to say, on the best day, this one leans left or right, but at the end of the day, they go back and forth. But they all have a leaning spot. They either lean to the left or to the right. There's no such thing as a neutral political person. There's no such thing as a neutral scientist. You either lean because you're believing in millions of years and you're believing in evolution, or you're believing in a creator. That is the only two choices. There is not a neutral stance, because neutrality doesn't get you anywhere. If I say, well, what do you believe about this item or that item? Everybody has an opinion. It would be odd for somebody to say, what do you think about religion as a whole? And somebody say, I don't have an opinion. I don't see a use for it. Well, I'm sorry, you just said an opinion. You just said you don't have a use for it.
Right.
If you say religion has no place in science, you actually just made a religious statement. You're saying science can only operate within certain parameters. If science is science, open the door. Let religion in. If religion's false, you'll prove it.
Good point. So what has been the creationist response to the discoveries of soft tissue in fossils?
Yeah. Honestly, at first it was, our ship has arrived. We have absolute proof there is a God. And the Bible is 100% accurate. Personally, and I think most people here at our ministry holds this view, is we don't need evidence to prove God or God is right or the Bible's right. We know in our hearts that we actually believe it 100% with or without any physical evidence. So I do caution people who say, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to go to the first non-believing atheist scientist I can find and show them a video on soft tissue. That'll prove to them there's a God. That was kind of the initial reaction, and I think that's calmed down a little bit to people say, well, but how does it apply to the Bible? How does it apply to what we believe about creation science? And we're finding that it actually is starting to confirm the Word of God. It gives us a stronger leg to stand on when we're having this discussion. But at the end of the day, evidence is interpreted through your worldview. But again, we don't find evidence in the fossil record that contradicts the biblical record. Now, I do find some science books that put in false data that contradicts the Bible, but that's not actual science. But when I go out and I go on a fossil dig, I don't pull up a bone that, like you said, that has a label on it or tag saying, oh, this bone's 65 million years old. I pull up a bone and I say, oh, look what happened during the worldwide flood.
Mm-hmm.
That's my worldview. But then if I test the bone, does anything I find in the testing method contradict the statement I just made? No. We're finding blood clots. That's a sign of the animal drowned in water. We're finding these huge animals in places like high deserts in Colorado, Montana, the Badlands, South Dakota. We're finding them in things with Wyoming, high elevations, huge animals that drowned in a lot of water because shallow seas don't drown dinosaurs.
So to play devil's advocate for a moment, let's say that I'm a skeptic, and the skeptic says, okay, so you found, you kind of already gave a couple of other things, but let's just say that I'm a skeptic that says, okay, so you found soft tissue, that's one evidence for your worldview, but would that really be enough, just one thing like that to topple, the evolutionary idea and age of these bones, or should we look for multiple proofs?
I think we should line up multiple proofs. If the next piece of evidence doesn't support the young Earth creation model, now we have to go back and re-examine the first piece of evidence. But if I had just one piece of evidence, that'd be pretty good. But if I had another one, let's say nerves, that'd be really good. What about blood vessels? That would be good. What about blood clots? That would be good. What if we found all that in the same bone, not just that bone, but multiple specimens of dinosaurs? Now I have multiple layers and I've also found them in sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock put there by water. And now all of a sudden I'm building a whole notebook full of things that suggest these animals died in water that were put down rapidly, and the water was deep, and animals could not outrun the rising water. So we have to start building this big picture that we don't just have one piece of evidence for young Earth creation model and the flood. We have multiples all around the world, all 7 continents. It's not rare. I could take you to any continent. We could find the same kind of flat sediments. We could find almost little or no erosion in the sediments. We would find billions of dead things laid down by water all over the earth, buried in these rock layers. We would be consistent. But if I start finding multiple things that overturn my young Earth creation view, then I need to examine my view.
Are we finding these fossils with soft tissue in pretty much just like one location? Because I know like our Triceratops bone that we talked about on a previous episode that has the blood clots, has the osteocytes and the collagen that was found in the same formation as Dr. Barry Schweitzer's T-Rex femur bone. Are all these fossils kind of coming from one area, or are we finding them multiple places around the nation and the world?
They're finding them in multiple places around the world. Any museum, whether it's a natural history museum here in the United States or abroad, can readily test their dinosaur collection that came out of the region, whether it's Europe, Asia, North America, South America. They're finding the same material. They're saying, oh, okay, well, it's there. So if it's found globally, then that would safely assume that there was a global event that caused it, because they all could not die for the same exact reason millions of years apart. So let's say that there's a dinosaur that they say attributes to the Jurassic period, and then here you have Triceratops, which they credit to the Cretaceous period. Just so you guys know, those two time periods, according to evolutionists, are separated by multiple millions of years. Yet, both dinosaur fossils have soft tissues, blood cells, blood clots, and possibly even nerves and things like that. The biomaterial is the same regardless of what layer is found in or what so-called time period is from. So for their worldview to be right, not only would there have to be a flood with a unique condition to create it, but it would have to happen multiple times over millions and millions of years, over and over and over again, to get the same exact results. The creation worldview is, hey, this was one global event. That's why we find consistency on all the continents. And not only are they finding collagen and blood cells, they're also finding different kind of things, these framboids and these other kind of connective type stuff, almost like ligaments. In Montana, we also pulled out fossilized ligaments. How do you fossilize a ligament? How long does a ligament lay there before it turns to a rock? In today's world, an animal kill, whether it be by vehicle or natural causes, usually results in decomposing, scavenging, all those kind of factors we see with our eyes. That's observational science. Why do we assume then that dinosaurs, by the hundreds, if not thousands, buried worldwide, all died in some kind of similar event and have all this material in there, yet they weren't scavenged on that much? They weren't chewed on a lot. They weren't. The things we see today tell us that these dinosaur bones, if they were there, would be so rare. But we can find them on every continent.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of a book I was reading once. It was kind of more of a dinosaur storybook, I guess, probably geared more towards elementary kids. And it was talking about this one dinosaur fossil that was found. And so it was hypothesizing what his life might have been like, and talked about how he was killed by a T-Rex, but for some reason was not eaten.
Yeah.
And I've always remembered that. It's like, I wonder why.
Yeah.
You know, T-Rex just goes around killing dinosaurs to thin the herd, but doesn't eat any of them. Yeah, but that's fairly common in the fossil record. In fact, it's very rare to find bones that have signs of scavenging, like you said.
Yeah. Well, like the T-Rex teeth marks they found from the Montana Hell Creek Formation, they found a Triceratops frill that had wound marks from a T-Rex tooth, but that wound had partially healed, which tells us the animal was alive during that time. It wasn't a scavenging event. It was possibly a fight or whatever reason they were there. They've also found some of the duck-billed dinosaur bones with the T-Rex teeth marks on them that are not partially healed. So then you think, oh, maybe that one, he was having a snack off the ground and he was scavenging because the bone didn't have time to heal. Or did T-Rex kill that creature, use his teeth? So, I mean, your mind can run wild, but at the same time, we see that those kind of things like you're talking about are rare. And when they find those, if you find a fossil with teeth mark in it, hold on to it. It is a gem to have.
Interesting. So when we discuss the different viewpoints on these soft tissues, and when we look at the evidence, we look at the fact of how they're buried and the lack of scavenger marks and what have you, which worldview, either the secular naturalist worldview or the biblical creation worldview, would you say best lines up with the evidence that we have?
If I was just neutral, which we already talked about, but if I was looking at the evidence for the first time, I would probably say, well, is there anybody out there that has a worldview that matches this? The needle would always point to the young earth creation model. There's nothing, again, in the fossil record we're finding that contradicts what the young earth creationist believes. We are finding items that contradict or does not line up with the expected discoveries of the old earth evolutionary or the old earth creationist. That is why I think that the evidence best matches what we call the biblical worldview model, that God created everything a few thousand years ago, and the animals that we find buried in the fossil record were created on either day 5 or day 6, depending on their species, and they were buried during the worldwide flood. Those that did survive, we do believe probably went extinct for multiple reasons, including the same reasons other animals go extinct today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't take a meteor to cause creatures to go extinct, because the bison in our country that almost went extinct, it wasn't meteor showers that was the problem.
No, it wasn't. And just to speak to that for a minute, if there was a meteor, let's assume there was, that did hit the Gulf of Mexico, let's assume that's where it hit at, and it was as large as they said, and it created the fallout that would kill dinosaurs. Would it only kill the dinosaurs that were alive at that time? See, they say the meteor hit during the Cretaceous period, towards the end. What about the dinosaurs that died in the Jurassic period? What killed them? Because remember, they died out multiple millions of years before Triceratop. What about the ones that were found in the other even the older time periods, in the older layers? Those dinosaurs, what killed them? Did we have multiple meteors hitting the Earth multiple times, causing multiple mass extinctions? See, it doesn't really make sense. Right. They do tell you, well, no, those dinosaurs died for other reasons. But the last of the dinosaurs, they died, and this mass extinction was caused by the meteor. But that's not really the story you hear, is it, Preston? It's the meteor killed the dinosaurs. And that's what most kids believe. But again, what killed the Jurassic dinosaurs? Well, the Jurassic dinosaurs are found buried in sedimentary rock, put there by water, and in their bones stuff they're finding soft tissues and blood cells.
So kind of for wrapping up today, covered some pretty heavy material looking at this from a very technical standpoint. But if there really was a worldwide flood, then what would we expect to find in the fossil record? You know, if that's true, just kind of to summarize what we've looked at, what would we find?
Oh, I think I'd expect to go out there and dig down and I'd find billions of dead things that were buried in those rock layers. Those rock layers would be laid down by water, and I'd find that all over the Earth. That's exactly what we find. And I would expect to find a lot of those fossils buried in the alive state, so to speak, like they were buried alive. That's exactly what we find. So I do believe that's the evidence that we find supports what you would expect to find. And I would expect to find red blood cells, soft tissues, nerves, osteocytes, all these other kind of stuff. So finding those kind of things like that tells me my worldview can't be that far off, because I expected to find those, and that's exactly what we found. So my question is to maybe the skeptic, the old earth creationist, or the evolutionist who believes in millions of years is, what would you expect to find if these dinosaurs were millions of years old? You would not expect to find them in sedimentary rock put there by water. You wouldn't expect to find blood cells. You wouldn't expect to find blood clots. If a meteor killed them, what would you expect to find? Blown up dinosaurs or dinosaurs that died in suffocation all over the world, all at the same time. But that's not what we find. We find dinosaurs from the top layer to the bottom, almost to the bottom layer. All throughout the fossil layers, we find remnants of some kind of dinosaur creatures. They're all mixed up. There is not an order to the fossil record. Just for our listeners to understand, when you think of this periods I was talking about, Cretaceous and Jurassic and others, those are man-made time periods. Those time periods do not exist in the rocks. That's something we've attributed to the rock layers. So basically, man gets to point at a certain amount of layers and say, okay, that layer right there, That stopped one time period. We call that a boundary, like maybe the KG boundary, or they give them these other initials. Then there was another time period, and then that one there had a boundary. Really? Now they're putting boundaries on imaginary boundaries on rocks that don't have boundaries. They are all mixed together. And one of the things, if you find fossils that they have attributed to a certain rock layer, and you go dig and you find that same exact species in a different rock layer, they call that disharmonious association in the fossil record. That means the fossil's out of place. So I believe that the evidence best fits the biblical worldview. And one of the things I like to add to that, if I could, is if there was a worldwide flood, then that means that the biblical record of the worldwide flood is true. If the biblical record of worldwide flood is true, the reason for that flood is true. It was a judgment of God upon the earth during that time, during that day. Why did God send a judgment? Those reasons are listed in the Scriptures. But in the middle of that judgment, there was also grace. God made a way of escape with Noah building the ark. There was preservation of life. There was a way to escape the flood. The Bible also says there's coming a second judgment. So if the first judgment actually happened, there's a real good chance the second judgment's going to happen too. If the first judgment, God made a way of escape, then wouldn't he also make a way of escape on the next judgment? Absolutely. And he did that through his Son, Jesus Christ. To those who accept what Jesus did on the cross and left the tomb empty and rose from the dead, to those who accept that gift from God, what Christ provided for everybody, they are guaranteed an escape from the coming judgment, the next one. And I almost wonder in my mind if some people think if they can dismiss the first judgment or negate it or somehow prove it wrong, then somehow the second one just won't happen. But what if the first one actually did happen and there was a worldwide flood? Can we then safely assume, based off statistics, that there will be a second judgment? I think that biblical worldview gives the best explanation for that.
Amen. I would agree. Well, Curtis, thank you for joining us today on the podcast and for all the work that you do at the Creation Museum. We really appreciate it.
It is a true blessing, and it's an opportunity I never thought I'd get to have, so thank you for having me on.
And we'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us today for the Creation Matters podcast. We invite you to come join us sometime at the Creation Experience Museum, where we give free guided tours 10 to 5, Wednesday through Saturday. If you would like to schedule one of those tours, you can call the museum at 417-561-0750, or you can visit our website at creationexperiencemuseum.com. Be sure to look for updates about upcoming podcasts on Facebook or Instagram, and be sure to join us next time when we will once again be using science to share the reliability and truth of God's Word and see how God's Word can be trusted all the way through.